Bruce Almighty is a 2003 American supernatural comedy film that remains one of the most beloved entries in Jim Carrey's filmography, blending broad physical comedy with a surprisingly sincere spiritual message about faith, humility, and gratitude. Directed by Tom Shadyac, who had already worked with Carrey on Ace Ventura, Pet Detective and Liar Liar, the film was written by Steve Coren, Mark O'Keefe, and Steve Udikirk, and was loosely inspired by Robert Bosch's 1996 novel Almighty Me, itself drawing heavily on the biblical book of Job. The movie was produced by Spyglass Entertainment, Shady Acres Entertainment, and Pitbull Productions, and was distributed worldwide by Universal Pictures. It premiered in Hollywood on May 14, 2003, before opening wide across the United States on May 23, 2003, over the Memorial Day weekend. The film runs for 101 minutes and was rated PG-13, and it went on to become a massive commercial success, earning an astonishing $484.6 million worldwide against a budget of around $81 million. A result that made it the fifth highest grossing film of that year and set a Memorial Day opening weekend record at the time with an opening haul of over $86 million, a number so strong it managed to outperform The Matrix Reloaded during the same period. The story of Bruce Almighty follows Bruce Nolan, played by Jim Carrey, a television field reporter working for Eyewitness News on a local Buffalo, New York station. Bruce is well liked for his humorous human interest segments, but he feels deeply unfulfilled because he desperately wants to be promoted to the anchor desk, a position he believes he deserves far more than his smug rival, Evan Baxter, portrayed by Steve Carell in an early breakout role before his rise to fame. Bruce has a loving, patient girlfriend named Grace, played by Jennifer Aniston, who works at a daycare and genuinely adores him despite his self-centered tendencies and his constant complaints about how unfair his life feels. On what becomes the worst day of his life, Bruce loses the anchor job to Evan, gets into a physical altercation after being provoked, and is fired from the station following a vulgar on-air outburst that gets broadcast to viewers. As if that were not enough, a series of increasingly absurd and humiliating misfortunes pile up around him, culminating in Bruce shouting furiously at the sky and blaming God for personally ruining his life and failing to do his job properly. That outburst does not go unanswered. Bruce receives a mysterious pager message directing him to an old, empty warehouse, where he comes face to face with God himself, portrayed with calm authority and gentle humor by Morgan Freeman. Rather than punishing Bruce, God decides to teach him a lesson by handing over all of his divine powers for 1 week, challenging Bruce to see if he believes he can do a better job running the universe. What follows is a whirlwind of comic set pieces as Bruce experiments with his newfound abilities, at first using them for petty personal gain and outrageous pranks, such as humiliating Evan on live television, parting a bowl of tomato soup like the Red Sea, and enlarging Grace's chest as a misguided romantic gesture that only causes friction between them. Bruce also uses his powers to boost his career, engineering incredible news stories that no other reporter could possibly have access to, which quickly earns him the coveted anchor position he always wanted. However, the fun and games begin to unravel once Bruce discovers just how overwhelming the responsibility of being God truly is, particularly when he tries to handle the prayers of the entire city of Buffalo at once by answering yes to every single request, a decision that spirals into citywide chaos, including a lottery in which everyone wins and receives only a few dollars each, sparking riots throughout the city. As Bruce's professional life flourishes, his personal relationship with Grace deteriorates because he is too consumed with his own ambitions and his obsession with power to notice her emotional needs, and Grace eventually leaves him after realizing he has become distant and unable to truly connect with her. The emotional core of Bruce Almighty comes into full focus as Bruce finally understands that the powers he has been given were never meant to serve his ego, but rather to teach him empathy, humility, and the value of free will. He begins to understand that God's real challenge is not about controlling outcomes for people but about allowing them to make their own choices, and that his own suffering has always been more about his own attitude and lack of gratitude than any true cosmic unfairness. When Grace is involved in a serious car accident, Bruce is faced with the ultimate test of his faith, having to decide whether to use his divine powers to force her to love him again or to let her make her own choice freely, and it is this decision that ultimately reveals his growth as a person. The film culminates in a heartfelt resolution in which Bruce prays not for anything for himself but for Grace's happiness and well-being, showing that he has finally learned the very lesson God intended for him all along, leading God to restore his own place in the universe while allowing Bruce to keep the wisdom and humility he gained from the experience. The cast of Bruce Almighty is filled with recognizable and talented performers who each bring something memorable to the film. Jim Carrey anchors the movie with his signature blend of manic physical comedy and heartfelt vulnerability as Bruce Nolan, delivering one of the most well-rounded performances of his career by balancing outrageous humor with real emotional stakes. Morgan Freeman brings a warm, wise, and almost effortlessly serene presence to the role of God, a casting choice that was widely praised for grounding the film's more chaotic comedic moments with genuine gravity and philosophical depth. Jennifer Aniston plays Grace Connolly with tenderness and quiet strength, portraying a woman who loves Bruce deeply but refuses to lose herself in his selfishness, giving the film its emotional anchor outside of the fantastical plot. Steve Carell, in what became a career-defining early role, plays Evan Baxter as a pompous and easily flustered rival newscaster, and his performance was so well received that it eventually led to his own spin-off film, Evan Almighty, released in 2007, in which Freeman reprised his role as God while Carell's character became the central figure of the story. The supporting cast includes Philip Baker Hall as Bruce's frustrated news director, Catherine Bell, Lisa and Walter as Bruce's loyal camera operator and friend, along with Nora Dunn, Eddie Jemison, and Sally Kirkland, all of whom contribute to the fabric of Bruce's chaotic professional and personal world. There is also a brief but memorable appearance by the legendary singer Tony Bennett, playing himself in one of the film's more whimsical divines. Behind the camera, the film benefited from the steady direction of Tom Shadyac, who had already proven with Liar Liar that he understood how to pair Jim Carrey's larger-than-life comedic energy with a story that carries genuine emotional and moral weight underneath the laughs. Cinematographer Dean Semler gave the film a bright, polished visual style fitting for a big-budget studio comedy, while composer John Debney's score helped shift smoothly between the film's comedic chaos and its more sincere, reflective moments. The film's screenplay, credited to Steve Coren, Mark O'Keefe, and Steve Udikirk, cleverly reworked the ancient themes of the Book of Job into a modern, accessible comedy that appealed to mainstream audiences without feeling preachy, which is part of why the film found such broad box office success despite receiving somewhat mixed reviews from critics at the time. Many reviewers praised Carrey's comic performance and Freeman's warm gravitas, while some felt the film's tonal shifts between slapstick humor and spiritual sincerity were uneven, yet audiences overwhelmingly embraced the film, turning it into a defining comedy of the early 2000s and cementing its place as one of the most quoted and rewatched films of that era. One of the more interesting and often overlooked details about Bruce Almighty is how its box office success became something of a cultural surprise within the industry, since it managed to dethrone The Matrix Reloaded during its opening weekend despite going up against one of the most anticipated sequels of that entire summer season. It is also worth noting that the film's success directly paved the way for its spin-off sequel, Evan Almighty, which at the time became one of the most expensive comedies ever made, showing just how much confidence the studio placed in the property after the original film's massive popularity. Another point worth mentioning is that for later home video and television broadcasts, certain elements of the film's script were modified slightly for content reasons, showing how thoroughly the film was tailored for the widest possible audience across different viewing platforms. Taken together, these details highlight just how significant Bruce Almighty was, not simply as a hit comedy but as a genuine cultural touchstone that combined big laughs with a surprisingly thoughtful message about faith, control, and what it truly means to appreciate the life you have been given. Bruce Nolan lived his life the way many people secretly do, convinced that the universe owed him more than what he currently had, and convinced that every small inconvenience in his day was somehow a deliberate act of cosmic unfairness directed specifically at him. He worked as a field reporter for Eyewitness News, a local television station in Buffalo, New York, and he had built a modest but loyal audience thanks to his charming, funny, and often absurd human interest segments. He covered stories about giant cookies, local festivals, and quirky community events, and while his reports were entertaining and well-produced, Bruce never felt any real satisfaction from them. He believed his talent was being wasted on fluff pieces while lesser reporters, in his opinion, were given more serious and prestigious assignments. What Bruce wanted more than anything else was to sit behind the news desk as the station's evening anchor, a position that in his mind would finally validate his years of hard work and prove to everyone, including himself, that he was destined for something bigger. The story opens on a day that begins like any other for Bruce, filled with small annoyances that he treats as personal insults from the universe. He wakes up already irritated, rushes through his morning routine, and heads out to cover another one of his human interest assignments, all the while venting his frustrations to his longtime cameraman and friend, a good-natured and endlessly patient woman who has grown used to Bruce's near-constant complaining. Despite his grumbling, there is an undeniable charisma to Bruce, a natural charm that makes him likable even when he is being difficult, and it is this exact charm that has made him a favorite among viewers, even if it has not yet translated into the career advancement he desperately craves. At home, Bruce shares his life with his girlfriend, Grace Connolly, a warm, kind, and endlessly supportive woman who works at a local daycare center. Grace loves Bruce deeply, seeing in him a good heart buried beneath his frustration and self-pity, and she consistently tries to help him find peace and perspective, gently reminding him that gratitude, not ambition, is the key to genuine happiness. Grace represents everything grounded and stable in Bruce's chaotic emotional world, and their relationship, though loving, is beginning to show cracks because Bruce is so wrapped up in his own dissatisfaction that he often fails to appreciate what he already has in her. She wants to build a future with him, to eventually get married and have a family, but Bruce is so distracted by his professional ambitions that these deeper conversations about their future together are constantly pushed aside or brushed off with jokes. The central rivalry of the film's opening act comes in the form of Evan Baxter, a fellow reporter at the same television station who represents everything Bruce feels he should be but is not. Evan is polished, articulate, and far more traditionally suited to sit behind an anchor desk, and he carries himself with an air of superiority that Bruce finds absolutely insufferable. The two men have a long-running professional rivalry, and Evan takes every opportunity to remind Bruce, sometimes subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, that he considers himself the superior journalist. This tension comes to a head when it is announced that the station's beloved evening anchor is retiring, opening up the exact position that Bruce has coveted for years. Both Bruce and Evan are considered as potential replacements, and Bruce becomes convinced that this is finally his moment, the opportunity he has been waiting for his entire career. Bruce prepares an ambitious pitch to secure the promotion, filled with confidence that his years of loyal service and popularity with viewers will finally be rewarded. However, when the decision is made, the station's news director chooses Evan Baxter instead of Bruce, delivering a crushing blow to Bruce's ego and self-worth. The rejection stings deeply, not just because Bruce feels professionally overlooked, but because it confirms his deepest fear that no matter how hard he works, he will always be passed over for something he believes he deserves. Rather than accepting the decision with grace, Bruce allows his anger and resentment to build, and this frustration begins to affect every part of his day, turning ordinary interactions into opportunities for him to feel victimized by the world around him. As if losing the promotion were not enough, Bruce's day continues to spiral out of control. While out on assignment, he is sent to cover what should have been a simple, heartwarming story, but the segment goes disastrously wrong due to unfortunate timing and a chain of chaotic events, culminating in him being humiliated on camera. His attempts to recover from this situation only make things worse, and eventually his anger and frustration explode into a vulgar, unfiltered outburst that is broadcast live to the station's viewers. Horrified by the unprofessional display, the station's management has no choice but to fire Bruce on the spot, effectively ending his career at Eyewitness News in the most humiliating way imaginable. In an instant, Bruce goes from being a well-liked local reporter with a shot at a promotion to being an unemployed, publicly embarrassed laughingstock. The disasters do not stop there. On his way home, still reeling from the shock of losing his job, Bruce becomes involved in a series of unfortunate and almost comically unlucky events. He is nearly involved in a car accident after swerving to avoid a reckless driver, and shortly afterward, in a moment of poetic misfortune, he is physically assaulted by a group of thugs after unintentionally provoking them, leaving him bruised, humiliated, and utterly defeated both physically and emotionally. Every small setback that day begins to feel like part of some grand conspiracy against him, reinforcing his belief that the universe, or whatever force controls it, has decided to make his life miserable on purpose. By the time Bruce arrives home, he is an emotional wreck, consumed by self-pity and rage. Grace tries to comfort him, offering the kind of gentle, loving support she always provides, but Bruce is too deep in his own misery to accept it gracefully. Instead of leaning on her support, he lashes out, allowing his frustration to spill over into their relationship, which only adds guilt to his growing pile of negative emotions. Later that night, alone with his thoughts, Bruce finally reaches his breaking point. Overwhelmed by everything that has gone wrong, he looks up toward the sky and unleashes a furious tirade against God, blaming him directly for ruining his life, mocking the idea that anyone up above is actually paying attention or doing a competent job managing the world. It is a raw, unfiltered explosion of anger, born from years of quiet resentment finally boiling over in one single, dramatic outburst. Not long after this outburst, something strange begins to happen. Bruce starts receiving mysterious pages on his pager, each one containing the same phone number with no name attached, appearing again and again no matter how many times he ignores or deletes them. Confused and increasingly frustrated, he eventually decides to call the number just to make the messages stop, only to be met with a strange and unsettling response. The voice on the other end gives him an address, an old, abandoned-looking warehouse building downtown, and Bruce, driven by equal parts curiosity and desperation, decides to go and investigate, half expecting some kind of prank or scam. When Bruce arrives at the warehouse, the space is eerily empty except for a single elevator, seemingly out of place inside the abandoned building. Hesitant but intrigued, Bruce steps inside, and the elevator begins to ascend, though the building itself does not appear to have enough floors to justify the ride. When the doors finally open, Bruce finds himself in a completely different environment, a plain white space filled with simple furniture, a stark contrast to the rundown warehouse below. There, he encounters a man dressed in a plain white suit, calm, dignified, and unassuming in appearance, who introduces himself in the simplest and most direct way imaginable, revealing that he is, in fact, God. At first, Bruce reacts with disbelief and sarcasm, assuming the man is either mentally unwell or playing some elaborate joke on him. But as strange, undeniable events begin to unfold around him, small demonstrations of impossible power that cannot be explained through any rational means, Bruce is forced to confront the unsettling truth that the man standing before him truly is who he claims to be. Rather than reacting with anger or punishment toward Bruce for his earlier outbursts, God responds with calm amusement, treating Bruce's complaints not as an insult but as an opportunity for a lesson. He proposes an extraordinary challenge, offering to grant Bruce all of his divine powers for 1 week, giving him the chance to prove that he can do a better job running the universe than God himself. Bruce, still skeptical but unable to resist the temptation of unlimited power, accepts the offer without fully understanding the consequences of what he has just agreed to. At first, Bruce treats his newfound powers as nothing more than an incredible personal toy, a limitless source of entertainment and convenience that he can use however he pleases. He wakes up the next morning testing the boundaries of his abilities in small, almost childlike ways, discovering that he can manipulate physical objects and reality itself with nothing more than a thought or a gesture. He experiments recklessly, performing outrageous acts simply because he can, ranging from playful manipulations of everyday objects around his apartment to increasingly bold displays of power in public. One of the most memorable early demonstrations of his powers comes during a quiet dinner, where Bruce casually parts a bowl of tomato soup in front of him exactly like the biblical parting of the Red Sea, laughing to himself at the absurdity and thrill of what he is capable of doing. As Bruce grows more comfortable with his powers, his ambition and pettiness begin to take center stage. He quickly turns his attention toward settling old scores, using his abilities to embarrass and humiliate his rival, Evan Baxter, during a live television broadcast. Bruce manipulates Evan's voice and body in increasingly ridiculous ways while he is on air, forcing him into a series of embarrassing, uncontrollable outbursts in front of the entire viewing audience. Bruce watches from home, thoroughly entertained by his rival's public humiliation, feeling a satisfying sense of long overdue revenge. What was once an unshakable, polished newsman is reduced to a stammering, chaotic mess on live television, and clips of the meltdown quickly spread, turning Evan into an unwitting viral sensation for all the wrong reasons. With his professional rival humiliated and effectively out of the picture, Bruce turns his attention toward reclaiming his own career. Using his divine powers to engineer incredible, exclusive news stories that no other reporter could possibly access, Bruce begins feeding the station a string of miraculous scoops, from dramatic rescues to bizarre unexplained phenomena, each of which he orchestrates behind the scenes using his abilities. His reports quickly become the most talked about coverage in the city, catapulting his popularity to new heights and effectively guaranteeing that when the station reconsiders its choice for anchor, Bruce becomes the obvious and inevitable choice. He is soon offered the very position he had been denied earlier, and this time, thanks to his manipulated success, there is no rival standing in his way. While Bruce's professional life is thriving beyond his wildest expectations, his personal life begins to unravel in ways he does not immediately notice. His growing obsession with his powers and his career leaves him increasingly distracted and emotionally. As Bruce continues to enjoy the intoxicating rush of unlimited power, he begins pushing the boundaries of his divine role even further, venturing into areas that go far beyond simple personal gain. Curious about the true scope of his abilities, Bruce decides to try answering prayers, tuning into the countless voices of people across Buffalo who are silently pleading for help, guidance, or blessings. At first, he finds the sheer number of prayers overwhelming and impossible to process individually, the voices flooding his mind in a chaotic, unrelenting wave that threatens to overwhelm him completely. Rather than taking the time to consider each prayer thoughtfully, Bruce, in a moment of exhausted frustration, decides to take an efficient but reckless shortcut, answering every single prayer in the city with a simple yes, regardless of what is actually being asked. This decision sets off a chain reaction of chaos throughout Buffalo. Because Bruce granted every wish indiscriminately, thousands of people who had prayed to win the lottery all end up winning simultaneously, resulting in a shared jackpot so thinly divided among the massive number of winners that each person receives only a handful of dollars instead of the life-changing sum they had hoped for. Furious and feeling cheated, despite technically getting exactly what they asked for, the disappointed winners take to the streets in anger, and riots break out across the city as frustration boils over into public unrest. Bruce watches the chaos unfold on the news, slowly beginning to realize, for the first time, the true weight and complexity of the responsibility he has been given. What seemed like a simple, generous solution has instead caused widespread disorder, revealing just how naive and short-sighted his approach to godhood has been. This growing realization marks an important turning point in the story, as Bruce starts to understand that being God is not simply about granting wishes or satisfying desires, but about balancing free will, consequence, and the deeper needs of every individual involved. Despite this dawning awareness, Bruce initially continues prioritizing his personal and professional ambitions over any deeper reflection, too consumed by his own success to fully absorb the lesson unfolding around him. His relationship with Grace continues to deteriorate as he becomes more distant, more self-absorbed, and less present in the everyday moments that matter to her. The emotional tension between Bruce and Grace reaches a breaking point during an important dinner, one that Grace hoped would bring them closer together, perhaps even leading Bruce toward the topic of their future and marriage. Instead, Bruce, distracted and overwhelmed by his overflowing sense of power and self-importance, fails to give Grace the attention and emotional presence she desperately needs. Sensing his emotional withdrawal and his failure to truly see her, Grace finally reaches her limit, realizing that Bruce has become someone she no longer recognizes, someone consumed by ego rather than love. Heartbroken and exhausted by the emotional distance that has grown between them, Grace makes the painful decision to leave Bruce, ending their relationship and leaving him utterly alone despite having every material and professional success he had ever wanted. Grace's departure hits Bruce harder than anything else that has happened throughout the entire film. For the first time, he is confronted with the reality that all the power in the universe means nothing if it comes at the cost of the person he truly loves. In his desperation, Bruce turns once again to his divine abilities, attempting to use them to force Grace to love him again, to manipulate her feelings and memories in an effort to undo the damage he has caused. However, when he attempts this manipulation, he discovers, to his shock and frustration, that even with all the powers of God at his disposal, he is completely unable to override another person's free will when it comes to matters of the heart. No matter how hard he tries, he cannot force Grace to feel something she does not genuinely feel, a revelation that humbles him in a way nothing else in the film has managed to do. This moment of powerlessness becomes a pivotal turning point for Bruce's character. Faced with the undeniable truth that love cannot be manufactured or controlled, even by someone wielding the power of God, Bruce begins to reflect more seriously on everything he has done throughout the week. He starts to recognize the pattern of selfishness that has defined his choices, realizing that he has spent his entire time as God pursuing personal gain, revenge, and validation rather than using his powers for anything truly meaningful or selfless. The weight of this realization begins to settle over him, and for the first time in the story, Bruce experiences genuine humility rather than mere frustration or self-pity. Around the same time, Bruce begins receiving reports and updates about the chaos still unfolding throughout Buffalo as a direct result of his earlier reckless decision to grant every prayer at once. The riots continue to spread, tensions in the city remain high, and Bruce is forced to witness firsthand the tangible, real-world consequences of his careless approach to responsibility. This mounting chaos, combined with the devastating loss of Grace, finally forces Bruce to confront the true scale of what he has been entrusted with, and he begins seeking out God once again, no longer out of curiosity or ambition, but out of genuine desperation for guidance and understanding. When Bruce finally reconnects with God, their conversation shifts significantly in tone compared to their earlier meeting. Where their first encounter was filled with playful skepticism and light-hearted challenge, this new exchange carries real emotional weight, as Bruce begins asking sincere questions about why the world operates the way it does, why suffering and hardship exist, and why prayers are not simply answered instantly and unconditionally. God responds with patience and wisdom, explaining to Bruce that granting every prayer without consideration for free will, growth, and consequence would strip away the very meaning of human choice and personal development. He explains that true miracles often come not from divine intervention overriding human will, but from people finding the strength within themselves to make positive choices, to help one another, and to grow through their own struggles rather than having every problem instantly solved for them. This conversation serves as the emotional and philosophical heart of the film, distilling its central message into a clear and meaningful lesson. Bruce begins to understand that his initial anger toward God stemmed from a fundamentally flawed way of looking at his own life, one rooted in entitlement, comparison, and a refusal to appreciate what he already had. He realizes that his obsession with recognition and validation, his resentment over being passed up for promotions, and his belief that the universe owed him something better were the true sources of his unhappiness, rather than any actual unfairness imposed upon him by fate or divine neglect. Armed with this newfound understanding, Bruce resolves to make things right, both within himself and within the chaos he has caused throughout the city. Determined to fix the disorder created by his reckless prayer answering, Bruce dedicates himself to helping restore order in Buffalo, using his remaining time with his powers not for personal gain, but in service of others, a stark and meaningful contrast to how he behaved earlier in the story. This shift represents the true transformation of his character, moving from selfish ambition toward genuine selflessness and responsibility. However, the film's most emotionally powerful moment comes when Grace, still reeling from her heartbreak over their failed relationship, is involved in a serious and frightening car accident. The news of her accident reaches Bruce at a moment when he is more emotionally aware and humbled than at any other point in the story, and it presents him with the ultimate test of everything he has learned throughout his time as God. Rushing to be by her side, Bruce is faced with an agonizing choice, one that forces him to decide between using his remaining divine power to save her life through direct intervention, or trusting in the deeper lesson he has come to understand about free will, fate, and the limits of his own control. In this pivotal moment, rather than attempting to manipulate the outcome entirely for his own benefit, as he might have done earlier in the story, Bruce makes a selfless choice. Instead of praying for Grace to simply love him again or for events to unfold exactly as he wishes, Bruce prays sincerely and humbly for her well-being, letting go of his own desires and placing her happiness above his own, even if that happiness does not include him. This moment of genuine selflessness represents the true culmination of Bruce's emotional journey throughout the film, proving that he has finally internalized the lesson God set out to teach him from the very beginning. Grace survives the accident, and in the aftermath, Bruce's genuine, selfless love for her becomes unmistakably clear, both to Grace and to the audience watching his transformation unfold. Their reconciliation feels earned rather than convenient, built upon Bruce's real, demonstrated growth rather than any manipulation of fate through divine power. Grace, sensing the authenticity of Bruce's changed heart, allows herself to reconnect with him, giving their relationship a second chance built on a foundation far more honest and mature than what existed between them at the beginning of the story. With his week as God coming to an end, Bruce returns to the strange white space where his extraordinary journey first began, meeting God once more to relinquish the powers he was given. This final meeting between the two carries a warmth and mutual respect that starkly contrasts with the skepticism and mockery that defined their first encounter. God acknowledges Bruce's growth throughout the week, expressing genuine pride in how far he has come, not because Bruce managed to solve every problem perfectly, but because he ultimately learned the deeper lessons of humility, gratitude, and selflessness that the entire experience was designed to teach him. As Bruce relinquishes his divine powers and returns to his ordinary human life, the film transitions into its final act, focusing on the more grounded, emotional resolution of Bruce's story. Rather than obsessing over his career ambitions or his previous resentment toward Evan Baxter, Bruce approaches his professional life with a newfound sense of perspective and gratitude. Despite everything that happened, he ultimately chooses to make peace with his circumstances, recognizing that true fulfillment comes not from titles, recognition, or professional status, but from meaningful relationships and inner contentment. In one of the film's final and most memorable emotional beats, Bruce is given the opportunity to speak publicly, using the platform to express genuine gratitude rather than his earlier bitterness and self-pity. This moment stands in sharp contrast to his behavior at the beginning of the story, symbolizing just how far his character has evolved throughout the course of the film. Rather than focusing on what he lacks or what he feels he deserves, Bruce openly expresses appreciation for the life he has, for the people who care about him, and for the lessons he has learned through his extraordinary and humbling experience. The film closes on a note of warmth, humor, and hope, reaffirming its core message that true happiness comes not from control, power, or external validation, but from gratitude, humility, and genuine connection with the people we love. Bruce's journey from an angry, self-absorbed man convinced the universe owed him something, to someone capable of genuine selflessness and appreciation for his life, forms the emotional backbone of the entire story, elevating Bruce Almighty beyond a simple comedy into a surprisingly heartfelt exploration of faith, personal growth, and the true meaning of fulfillment. Throughout its runtime, Bruce Almighty masterfully balances outrageous, larger-than-life comedic moments with genuine emotional depth, using Bruce's chaotic and often selfish misadventures with divine power as a vehicle to explore much larger questions about faith, gratitude, and the human tendency to focus on what we lack rather than appreciating what we already have. The film's clever reworking of the biblical story of Job into a modern, accessible narrative allows it to explore weighty philosophical and spiritual themes without ever feeling heavy-handed, wrapping its message within Jim Carrey's manic energy and Morgan Freeman's calm, wise presence as God. By the time the credits roll, audiences are left not only entertained by the film's endless string of comedic set pieces, but also genuinely moved by Bruce's transformation from a bitter, resentful man into someone capable of true humility, gratitude, and selfless love. Jim Carrey stands as the beating comedic heart of Bruce Almighty, and his own life story is every bit as dramatic, unpredictable, and ultimately triumphant as any character he has ever played on screen. He was born James Eugene Carrey on January 17, 1962, in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada, the youngest of 4 children born to Percy Carey, an accountant who had once dreamed of being a professional jazz musician, and Kathleen Carey, a homemaker who struggled for years with poor health and depression. From a very early age, young Jim discovered that making people laugh was a powerful way to bring light into a household that often felt heavy with worry, and he has spoken openly in interviews about how he would perform silly faces, impressions, and physical comedy routines specifically to try to cheer up his mother during her darkest moments. This instinct to turn pain into performance would go on to define his entire career. His childhood took a difficult turn when his family faced serious financial hardship after his father lost his job, forcing the entire Carey family to take on demeaning work, including security and janitorial jobs at a local factory, with young Jim himself working long shifts after school just to help make ends meet. For a period, the family was even without a stable home, living for a time out of a camper van, an experience that left a lasting impression on Carey and shaped the relentless drive and work ethic that would later fuel his rise to stardom. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, Carey never abandoned his love of performing. He began doing stand-up comedy at the astonishingly young age of 15, taking the stage at a comedy club in Toronto after his father drove him there, and although his very first set reportedly did not go particularly well, he refused to give up. He continued sharpening his comedic instincts, developing a reputation as a gifted impressionist and physical comedian throughout his teenage years, eventually deciding to leave school entirely to pursue comedy full-time. At the age of 19, Carey made the bold decision to relocate to Los Angeles, immersing himself in the competitive world of American stand-up comedy, performing regularly at legendary venues like the Comedy Store while also picking up small television and film roles to help pay the bills. His earliest screen credits included minor television appearances and small film roles throughout the 1980s, but his true breakthrough on television came when he joined the sketch comedy series In Living Color in the early 1990s, a show that helped launch several major comedic careers of that era. It was during this period that Carrey truly began to hone the exaggerated physical comedy style that would eventually make him one of the biggest movie stars in the world. The year 1994 proved to be the turning point of his entire career, as he starred in 3 enormously successful comedies within the same year: Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber, each of which showcased his rubber-faced expressions, boundless physical energy, and fearless commitment to comedic absurdity. Almost overnight, Carrey transformed from a working comedian into one of the most recognizable and highest-paid actors in Hollywood, a meteoric rise so sudden that he found himself gracing the covers of major magazines within the same month. Throughout the mid to late 1990s, Carrey continued building on this momentum with box office hits like Batman Forever and Liar Liar, the latter of which marked his first collaboration with director Tom Shadyac, who would later direct him again in Bruce Almighty. However, Carrey also began proving that he was far more than just a slapstick comedian, delivering critically acclaimed dramatic performances in films like The Truman Show and Man on the Moon, both of which earned him Golden Globe awards and cemented his reputation as a genuinely versatile actor capable of balancing outrageous comedy with real emotional depth. By the time Bruce Almighty arrived in 2003, Carrey was already a seasoned veteran of blending humor and heart, and his performance as Bruce Nolan allowed him to showcase both sides of his talent within a single film, delivering huge laughs while also conveying real vulnerability and growth. In the years following Bruce Almighty, Carrey continued to alternate between comedy and drama, delivering one of the most acclaimed performances of his entire career in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a film many critics consider among the finest work of his career, followed by continued box office success in films like Fun with Dick and Jane and Yes Man. In later years, Carrey has spoken candidly and publicly about his lifelong struggles with depression, using his platform to raise awareness about mental health while also pursuing a growing passion for painting and visual art, which he has described as a deeply personal and therapeutic outlet. He gradually stepped back from frequent film roles during the late 2010s, though he found renewed acclaim starring in the Showtime series Kidding, and reintroduced himself to a new generation of fans by playing the villainous Dr. Robotnik in the hugely successful Sonic the Hedgehog film franchise. Carrey's life story, from a homeless teenager working factory shifts to one of the most beloved entertainers in the world, remains one of the most inspiring examples of resilience and reinvention in modern Hollywood history. Morgan Freeman, who brought calm wisdom and quiet authority to the role of God in Bruce Almighty, has one of the most fascinating and unconventional career trajectories in all of Hollywood, largely because his path to stardom did not truly accelerate until relatively late in his life. He was born on June 1, 1937, in Memphis, Tennessee, to Morgan Porterfield Freeman Sr., a barber, and Mamie Edna Freeman, a schoolteacher, into a working-class family that eventually grew to include 6 children. Due to his parents' need to travel for work during difficult economic times, young Morgan spent much of his early childhood being raised primarily by his grandmother in Charleston, Mississippi, only reuniting more permanently with his parents later as the family eventually settled in Greenwood, Mississippi. Freeman has often described himself as a reluctant and unenthusiastic student throughout much of his early education, someone who found little joy in traditional academics but who discovered a genuine passion for the school's extracurricular music and theater programs. It was during these formative school years that he first experienced the stage, taking part in a citywide dramatic competition at just 12 years old and winning top honors, an early sign of the talent that would eventually define his life. Despite this early success in performance, Freeman's true childhood dream was not acting at all, but rather becoming a fighter pilot, a passion that led him to turn down a partial drama scholarship after high school in favor of joining the United States Air Force. He served from 1955 to 1959, working primarily as a mechanic and radar technician rather than fulfilling his dream of flying combat missions, an experience that ultimately left him disillusioned with military life and uncertain about his future direction. After his discharge from the Air Force, Freeman made the difficult decision to pursue acting professionally, moving first to Los Angeles and later to New York City, where he spent years surviving on a series of unglamorous day jobs while relentlessly auditioning for theater roles during the evenings. This period of struggle lasted for years, with Freeman slowly building his craft through small stage productions until he finally landed a meaningful role in an all-black Broadway production of the musical Hello, Dolly! In the late 1960s, a breakthrough that opened the door to further opportunities. His most significant early career milestone came when he was cast as the beloved character Easy Reader on the educational children's television program The Electric Company, a role he played for several years throughout the early to mid-1970s that introduced him to a wide audience, even though it would still be many more years before mainstream film stardom arrived. Freeman continued building his reputation through the 1970s and 1980s primarily through respected stage work and smaller film and television roles, steadily earning a reputation among industry insiders as an actor of remarkable depth and gravitas, even as broader public recognition remained elusive. His fortunes began to shift dramatically in the late 1980s, when he delivered a string of critically acclaimed performances in films such as Street Smart, which earned him his first Academy Award nomination, followed shortly after by his unforgettable and deeply moving performance in Driving Miss Daisy, which won him a Golden Globe Award and further cemented his status as one of the finest actors of his generation. Throughout the 1990s, Freeman continued to build an extraordinary body of work, delivering iconic performances in films like Glory, Unforgiven, and perhaps most memorably, The Shawshank Redemption, a film that, despite modest box office returns upon its initial release, has since gone on to become one of the most beloved and critically respected films in cinematic history, largely due to Freeman's warm, narratively central performance as Red. By the time he took on the role of God in Bruce Almighty in 2003, Freeman had already firmly established himself as one of the most trusted and respected voices in American cinema, making him a perfect choice for a role that required both comedic timing and genuine spiritual gravitas. His career continued to flourish in the years following, delivering another Academy Award-winning performance, this time for Best Supporting Actor, in $1 Million Baby in 2004, and going on to appear in numerous other beloved films, including Batman Begins and its sequels as the wise Lucius Fox, along with a wide range of other acclaimed and commercially successful projects. Freeman has often reflected candidly on the slow, difficult journey to his eventual success, expressing gratitude rather than bitterness about the decades it took him to achieve widespread recognition, noting that his later blooming success allowed him to appreciate his achievements all the more deeply. Jennifer Aniston, who brought warmth and emotional grounding to the role of Grace in Bruce Almighty, was born Jennifer Joanna Aniston on February 11, 1969, in Sherman Oaks, California, into a family with deep roots in the entertainment industry. Her father, John Aniston, was a working actor best known for his long-running role on the soap opera Days of Our Lives, while her mother, Nancy Dow, had also worked as an actress earlier in her career, meaning that young Jennifer grew up surrounded by the realities of show business from a very early age. Despite this family connection to entertainment, her childhood was not without significant emotional difficulty, as her parents divorced when she was only 9 years old, an event that left a lasting impact on her and led her to be raised primarily by her mother following the separation. Aniston attended the prestigious High School of Performing Arts in New York City, where she studied drama seriously and began building the foundational skills that would eventually launch her professional career, going on to spend several formative years performing in various off-Broadway theatrical productions during the late 1980s. Her early television career, however, was marked by a frustrating string of setbacks, as she found herself cast in a series of shows that were quickly cancelled, including the short-lived series Malloy and a role on Ferris Bueller, a television adaptation of the popular film that failed to find an audience. After facing repeated career disappointments, Aniston reportedly reached a point of such deep discouragement that she approached a television executive to ask candidly whether she had any real future in the industry at all, a moment of vulnerability that speaks to just how uncertain her path to stardom initially seemed. Everything changed in 1994 when she was cast in the ensemble comedy series Friends, originally reading for the role of Monica Geller before ultimately securing the part of Rachel Green, a decision that would go on to define both her career and an entire era of popular culture. Rachel Green quickly became one of the most beloved and culturally influential characters in television history, with Aniston's performance earning her an Emmy Award and a Golden Globe Award, while her signature hairstyle, famously nicknamed the Rachel, became one of the most requested and copied haircuts of the decade. Although her massive success on Friends brought Aniston enormous fame, it also created a challenging period of typecasting, as audiences and casting directors struggled to see her as anything other than the bubbly, fashionable Rachel Green. Aniston made a deliberate and successful effort to break away from this narrow perception by taking on the more understated, dramatically grounded role of an unhappy cashier in the independent film The Good Girl, a performance that earned significant critical praise and demonstrated her range beyond romantic comedy. This critical success opened the door to a steady stream of major film roles throughout the early 2000s, including her role as Grace in Bruce Almighty in 2003, which showcased her ability to bring emotional authenticity and charm to a supporting role within a larger, effects-driven comedy. Following the conclusion of Friends in 2004, Aniston transitioned fully into a prolific film career, alternating between smaller independent projects and major studio productions, appearing in a long list of successful films including Along Came Polly, Marley and Me, The Breakup, Horrible Bosses, and We're the Millers, consistently proving her ability to anchor both comedic and dramatic material. In more recent years, Aniston has continued to expand her body of work, earning further critical acclaim and award recognition for her performance in the Apple TV series The Morning Show, demonstrating that even decades after her breakthrough on Friends, she remains one of the most enduringly popular and respected actresses in the entertainment industry. Steve Carell, whose unforgettable turn as the pompous rival reporter Evan Baxter became one of the most talked about supporting performances in Bruce Almighty, was born Stephen John Carell on August 16, 1962, in Concord, Massachusetts, the youngest of 4 sons born to Edwin Carell, an electrical engineer, and Harriet Carell, a psychiatric nurse. His father's family had originally carried the surname Caroselli before it was changed to Carell, reflecting the family's Italian heritage, while his mother's side of the family traced its roots back to Poland. Carell was raised in the nearby town of Acton, Massachusetts, attending a series of private schools where he participated actively in sports like ice hockey and lacrosse, developing an early interest in history that would later influence his decision to attend Denison University in Granville, Ohio, where he pursued a degree in history while initially harboring ambitions of eventually attending law school. However, during his time at Denison, Carell discovered a passion for performance through the university's improv comedy troupe, an experience that ultimately redirected his career ambitions entirely away from law and toward the world of comedy and acting. After graduating in 1984, Carell began building his comedic skills through improv performance, eventually auditioning for Saturday Night Live in the early 1990s, an audition that famously did not result in him landing a spot on the show, with the role instead going to fellow comedian Will Ferrell. Rather than viewing this rejection as a career-ending setback, Carell continued pursuing opportunities in comedy, taking on a variety of supporting roles in short-lived television series throughout the 1990s while also appearing in commercials and smaller guest spots to help sustain his career during the lean years. A significant turning point came in 1999 when Carell joined The Daily Show with Jon Stewart as a correspondent, a role he held for several years and one that allowed him to showcase his distinctive deadpan comedic style to a growing and appreciative audience, eventually leading to larger opportunities in film. His breakthrough into film roles began to take shape in the early 2000s, with Bruce Almighty in 2003 serving as one of his earliest widely seen supporting roles, showcasing the kind of exaggerated, high-energy comedic performance that would soon become his trademark. That same period also saw him appear in the ensemble comedy Anchorman, further building his reputation within the comedy film world. Carell's true breakout leading role arrived in 2005 with The 40-Year-Old Virgin, a sleeper hit comedy that proved he could successfully carry a film as the lead actor, earning widespread critical praise and solidifying his status as a rising comedic star. That same year, Carell was cast as bumbling regional manager Michael Scott in the American adaptation of the British television series The Office, a role that would go on to define much of his career throughout the following decade. His performance as Michael Scott earned him a Golden Globe Award along with numerous Emmy nominations throughout the show's run, and the character became widely regarded as one of the most iconic figures in modern television comedy. Despite his massive television success, Carell continued building a parallel film career throughout this period, taking on a wide variety of roles across different genres, and he notably went on to headline Evan Almighty, the spin-off sequel to Bruce Almighty that expanded his character Evan Baxter into a leading role, with Morgan Freeman also returning to reprise his role as God. Carell made the significant decision to depart from The Office in 2011 in order to focus more fully on his film career, a decision that proved successful as he went on to deliver both comedic and increasingly dramatic performances in a wide range of acclaimed films, including a critically praised, Oscar-nominated dramatic turn in Foxcatcher. Along with continued box office success voicing the character grew in the massively popular Despicable Me animated film franchise. Philip Baker Hall, who brought a stern, no-nonsense presence to the role of Bruce's frustrated news director Jack Baylor, lived one of the more unusual and inspiring career trajectories in Hollywood, largely because he did not begin pursuing acting seriously until relatively late in life. He was born on September 10, 1931, in Toledo, Ohio, into a family that faced significant financial hardship during the Great Depression after his father's tire business collapsed, leaving the family struggling for many years afterward. Rather than pursuing acting immediately after his education, Hall instead spent time serving as an army translator stationed in Germany, and later worked for a period as a high school English teacher, living what most would consider a conventional, stable working life well into his 20s and 30s. It was not until around the age of 30 that Hall made the unconventional decision to pursue acting professionally, a remarkably late start compared to most of his peers in the industry, but one that ultimately led to a career spanning more than 5 decades. He began building his craft primarily through theater work in Los Angeles, slowly earning small parts in television throughout the 1970s while continuing to hone his skills on stage. His first major breakthrough came in 1984 when he starred as a fictionalized version of President Richard Nixon in Robert Altman's film Secret Honor, a demanding one-man performance that required him to carry an entire film essentially by himself, earning him significant critical acclaim and establishing him as a serious dramatic talent within independent film circles. Throughout the late 1980s, Hall continued building a reputation as a reliable and compelling character actor, appearing in notable supporting roles in films such as Midnight Run alongside Robert De Niro and the beloved romantic comedy Say Anything. His career reached new creative heights during the 1990s through his collaborations with filmmaker Paul Thomas Anderson, appearing in Anderson's directorial debut Hard Eight, followed by memorable supporting turns in Boogie Nights and later a widely praised performance as television personality Jimmy Gator in the acclaimed ensemble drama Magnolia. Around this same period, Hall also earned lasting recognition among television audiences for his memorable guest appearances on the sitcom Seinfeld, portraying an intensely dedicated library investigator named Joe Bookman whose relentless pursuit of an overdue library book became one of the most quoted and beloved storylines in the show's history. By the time he appeared in Bruce Almighty in 2003, Hall had firmly established himself as one of Hollywood's most respected and instantly recognizable character actors, someone directors trusted to bring authenticity and gravity to authority figures and world-weary professionals. He continued working steadily throughout the 2000s and into the following decade, appearing in a wide range of acclaimed films and television series, including memorable roles in Zodiac and Argo, along with a recurring role on the popular sitcom Modern Family. Hall passed away on June 12, 2022, in Glendale, California, at the age of 90, leaving behind a body of work that spanned more than 6 decades and cemented his reputation as one of the most respected and consistently excellent character actors of his generation. Catherine Bell, who played the composed and elegant Susan Ortega in Bruce Almighty, was born Catherine Lisa Bell on August 14, 1968, in London, England, to a Scottish father and an Iranian mother, before her family relocated to Los Angeles, California when she was still very young following her parents' divorce. Raised primarily by her mother in California, Bell developed an early interest in academics, initially enrolling at the University of California, Los Angeles to study biology with aspirations toward a career in medicine, though she eventually chose to leave her studies behind in order to pursue a career in modeling. Her modeling career took her to Japan, where she built a successful international career in front of the camera before eventually deciding to transition into acting, studying her craft at the well-regarded Beverly Hills Playhouse under the guidance of respected instructor Milton Katsilas. During this period of career transition, Bell also worked for several years as a professional massage therapist at a prestigious hotel to support herself financially, a job that reportedly included musician Peter Gabriel among her regular clients. Her earliest credited screen work included serving as a body double for actress Isabella Rossellini in the 1992 film Death Becomes Her, a small but notable entry point into the film industry that helped introduce her to further opportunities. Bell continued building her acting resume throughout the early 1990s with a variety of small television and film roles, including an early appearance in the 1994 action film Men of War, before landing what would become the defining role of her career. She was cast in a small supporting role on the military legal drama JAG, but after the character was tragically written off the show at the end of its first season, Bell took the bold step of writing directly to the show's creator requesting a new, expanded role, a request that ultimately resulted in her being cast as the show's new female lead, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mackenzie, when the series moved from NBC to CBS. This role transformed Bell into one of television's most recognized leading ladies throughout the late 1990s and into the mid-2000s, with the series running successfully for 8 seasons and earning her a devoted fan base. During the same period of major television success, Bell also took on a memorable supporting film role in Bruce Almighty in 2003, further expanding her presence in mainstream film. Following the conclusion of JAG in 2005, Bell continued building an impressive and varied television career, taking on the emotionally demanding role of a military spouse dealing with domestic abuse in the drama series Army Wives, a performance that earned considerable critical praise for revealing new depths to her acting range beyond her earlier, more light-hearted television work. She later found continued success starring as the central character in the long-running and widely beloved Hallmark Channel franchise The Good Witch, both in its television movie format and later as a full series, a role that further cemented her status as a beloved and enduring television star across multiple genres and generations of audiences. Lisa Ann Walter, who brought sharp comedic energy to her supporting role in Bruce Almighty as Bruce's loyal camera operator, was born on August 3, 1963, in Silver Spring, Maryland, growing up in a family that valued both academic achievement and creative expression. Her father worked for NASA while also indulging a personal passion for community theater performance after hours, and her mother worked as a teacher, a combination of influences that likely helped shape Walter's own eventual path toward a career blending intelligence and comedic performance. She attended Montgomery Blair High School before going on to study drama at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., graduating with a theater degree in 1983 after training under the respected instructor Father Gilbert Hartke. Walter's early career unfolded primarily through stand-up comedy, where she built a national touring reputation over several years as a headlining comedian known for her bold, boisterous, and highly energetic performance style, eventually opening for major touring acts and steadily building her name within the comedy circuit. Her television career began to take shape in the mid-1990s, when she was cast in the Fox series My Wildest Dreams in 1995, and shortly afterward, she co-created and starred in her own ABC sitcom titled Life's Work, in which she played a hardworking assistant U.S. attorney balancing the competing demands of her career and family life. Around this same period, Walter also began building a film career, delivering a memorable supporting performance in the 1996 film Eddie alongside Whoopi Goldberg. Her most widely recognized early film role came in 1998, when she was cast as Chessie, the beloved and comedically dependable housekeeper in the hit Disney remake of The Parent Trap, a role that introduced her to a massive family audience and remains one of the performances she is most fondly remembered for by longtime fans. Walter continued building a steady and varied career throughout the early 2000s, appearing in a wide range of films including her supporting role in Bruce Almighty in 2003, followed by additional notable film appearances in Shall We Dance alongside Richard Gere and Jennifer Lopez, as well as a role in Steven Spielberg's blockbuster science fiction film War of the Worlds starring Tom Cruise. Beyond her acting work, Walter has also built a significant career behind the camera as a television producer, developing and hosting various reality television projects throughout the years, while also continuing to perform stand-up comedy at prominent venues and maintaining her long-standing reputation as a sharp, unfiltered comedic voice. In more recent years, Walter has experienced a remarkable career resurgence, earning widespread critical acclaim and a new generation of devoted fans for her role as the tough, street-smart teacher Melissa Scamenti on the hit ABC mockumentary sitcom Abbott Elementary. A performance that has earned her a Screen Actors Guild Award as part of the show's ensemble cast and reintroduced her comedic talents to mainstream audiences decades after her earliest television successes. Bringing Bruce Almighty to life required far more than just a clever script and a talented cast, and the story behind its production is filled with fascinating decisions, unexpected challenges, and genuinely hilarious moments that occurred both in front of and behind the camera. The film was made on a substantial budget of around $81 million, a significant investment for what was fundamentally a comedy rather than an effects-heavy blockbuster, but one that reflected the studio's confidence in pairing Jim Carrey's enormous box office draw with a concept ambitious enough to require real visual effects work to convincingly depict a man wielding the powers of God. That confidence paid off in spectacular fashion, as the film went on to earn close to $500 million worldwide, meaning the final box office return was roughly 6 times the original production budget. A result that made Bruce Almighty one of the most profitable comedies of its entire decade and proved that audiences were eager to see Carrey paired with a premise big enough to match his larger-than-life comedic energy. The origins of the film's story are just as interesting as its eventual success, tracing back to a casual late-night conversation between screenwriters Steve Coren and Mark O'Keefe, 2 friends and neighbors who had gathered for food after Mark had just been let go from his job writing on a spin-off of the massively popular sitcom Friends. During that conversation, the 2 writers began riffing on various high-concept transformation ideas, tossing around silly premises like a man turning into a dog, before eventually landing on the far more ambitious and unusual idea of a man being given the powers of God. They recognized that stories about ordinary people encountering the divine had certainly been explored before in Hollywood, most notably in the classic film Oh, God, starring George Burns, but they felt strongly that their specific angle, built around the question of why God would ever hand over his powers to a flawed, frustrated human being, offered something fresh and comedically rich that had not quite been done in that exact way before. This spark of an idea eventually developed into the fully realized screenplay that would become Bruce Almighty, with Steve Udikirk later joining the writing process to help refine and polish the script further before production began. Casting decisions played an enormous role in shaping the tone and success of the film, and perhaps none proved more important than the choice to cast Morgan Freeman in the role of God. Freeman's calm, authoritative voice and dignified screen presence brought a sense of genuine gravity and warmth to a role that, in less careful hands, could easily have become a one-note comedic gimmick. His casting allowed the film to strike a delicate balance between broad comedy and sincere spiritual reflection, giving audiences a version of God who felt wise and believable even while participating in some of the film's sillier comedic set pieces. Jim Carrey, for his part, brought his signature manic energy and physical comedy instincts to the role of Bruce Nolan, though interestingly, several people involved in the production have noted that the version of Bruce audiences ultimately saw on screen was actually somewhat more restrained and grounded compared to some of Carrey's earlier iconic performances. Reports from the production reveal that a number of scenes originally filmed lean much further into Carrey's classic over-the-top, exaggerated comedic style, but many of these wilder moments were ultimately trimmed back or cut entirely from the final theatrical version in order to keep Bruce feeling like a relatable, sympathetic character rather than a completely cartoonish figure. Since the emotional core of the story depended on audiences genuinely caring about Bruce's journey toward humility and growth. One particularly interesting piece of trivia involves the very name of the film's protagonist, as the writers have confirmed that Bruce Nolan was deliberately named as a tribute to the legendary musician Bruce Springsteen, reflecting the personal fandom of the writing team for the artist widely nicknamed the Boss. This small but charming detail speaks to the playful spirit that the writers brought into crafting the film's characters, even as they tackled weighty philosophical themes about faith and free will underneath the comedy. Another notable creative decision involved the film's setting, as the story takes place specifically in Buffalo, New York, a choice directly inspired by Jim Carrey's own childhood. Carrey grew up in Toronto, Ontario, a city located just north of Buffalo, and as a kid he regularly watched the local Buffalo television station's eyewitness news broadcasts, meaning the film's entire premise of a local Buffalo news reporter losing his mind over professional frustration carried a small personal connection back to Carrey's own upbringing. Despite being set in Buffalo, the film was not actually filmed there, and eagle-eyed viewers who are familiar with film production have long pointed out that much of Bruce Almighty was shot using the iconic Courthouse Square set located on the Universal Studios Hollywood backlit in California. A location so frequently reused across countless film and television productions that it has become one of the most recognizable pieces of movie-making real estate in the world. This kind of resourceful location work is extremely common in mid-budget studio productions, allowing filmmakers to create a believable small city setting without the logistical challenges and costs associated with shutting down real city streets for an extended shoot, and it speaks to how much of the film's budget was likely allocated instead toward its more technically demanding visual effects sequences, which needed to convincingly depict everything from parting a bowl of soup to Bruce walking across the surface of a swimming pool. Perhaps no single scene from the entire production has generated more behind-the-scenes discussion and admiration than the now legendary teleprompter sequence involving Steve Carell's character, Evan Baxter, being humiliated live on air after Bruce uses his divine powers to control his voice and scramble his teleprompter script. According to the film's screenwriters, this now iconic scene was not actually part of the original screenplay in its final, fully realized form, and evolved significantly once Steve Carell became involved in the production. Screenwriter Mark O'Keefe has explained in interviews that the original concept behind the scene was loosely inspired by an entirely different scenario, one involving a car dealership manager character being manipulated into saying embarrassing things. But once the production shifted the setting to a news broadcast and brought Carell into the role, the scene transformed into something far more memorable. Largely thanks to Carell's own comedic instincts and his willingness to improvise extensively during filming. Both O'Keefe and his writing partner Steve Coren have spoken with clear admiration about how much credit belongs to Carell for elevating that scene beyond what was originally written, with Coren specifically noting that audiences and critics alike should recognize just how much of the scene's brilliance came from Carell's own improvisational choices layered on top of the foundational script. The technical execution of that now famous gibberish sequence involved a genuinely fascinating and unusual production process. According to film editor Scott Hill, who worked on cutting the movie together, the scene required syncing two separate improvised performances that were not actually filmed together in the same space at the same time in a traditional sense. Jim Carrey's character Bruce is shown manipulating Evan from a separate control booth, meaning Carrey's physical performance of mouthing along with the gibberish and controlling the teleprompter was captured somewhat independently from Steve Carell's on-camera meltdown as the humiliated anchorman speaking complete nonsense live on air. Both actors were essentially improvising extensively during their respective filming sessions rather than working from a tightly scripted and rehearsed dialogue exchange, which made the editing process significantly more complex, since the editorial team needed to carefully select and align the best improvised takes from each actor in order to create the illusion of a perfectly synchronized, seamless comedic exchange between the two characters. The final result required painstaking attention to matching Carrey's exaggerated mouth movements, as he supposedly controlled Evan's voice with the actual sounds and gibberish phrases that Carell had improvised separately. And the fact that the finished scene reads so effortlessly and hilariously on screen speaks to just how skillfully the editorial team was able to piece together these two independently improvised comedic performances into one cohesive, perfectly timed sequence. The impact of this single scene on Steve Carell's career cannot be overstated, and many entertainment industry observers and fans alike consider this particular performance to be the true turning point that first put Carell on the radar of major Hollywood decision-makers. At the time Bruce Almighty was filmed and released, Carell was still primarily known to audiences for his work as a correspondent on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and while he had certainly built a loyal following through that platform, he had not yet become the household name he would soon become following the release of The 40-Year-Old Virgin and his subsequent star-making turn on the American version of The Office. According to accounts from those involved in the production, when the film was screened for Jim Carrey during a period when he was busy filming Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind elsewhere, Carrey was reportedly so impressed and delighted by the reaction of the test audience to Carell's performance during that specific scene that he turned directly to director Tom Shadyac afterward and insisted that the scene not be touched or altered in any way during further editing, recognizing immediately just how special and effective the comedic timing already was. This kind of generous, supportive reaction from a lead actor as famous and established as Carrey toward a rising supporting performer speaks well of the collaborative atmosphere that existed on set, and it is a testament to Carrey's confidence and generosity as a performer that he did not feel threatened by being upstaged in that particular moment, but instead celebrated the scene's comedic success. While the finished film ultimately maintained a relatively family-friendly, feel-good tone throughout, the production process actually involved filming a number of significantly darker and more extreme versions of certain scenes that were ultimately cut from the theatrical release specifically because they risked making Bruce's character feel too cruel or unsympathetic to audiences. One particularly striking example involves an alternate, more extended version of the very same teleprompter humiliation scene involving Evan Baxter. In this cut sequence, rather than simply being reduced to babbling gibberish, Bruce's manipulation of Evan on live television escalated dramatically further, causing his nose to bleed uncontrollably on air before ultimately causing his hair to spontaneously catch fire, not just once but reportedly twice within the same sequence. Steve Carell himself has spoken about this deleted moment in interviews, revealing that the production crew actually rigged a real gas line connected to a portion of his head specifically in order to create a genuine, practical fire effect for the shot rather than relying entirely on visual effects, a detail that speaks to just how committed the production was to achieving convincingly outrageous physical comedy. even for material that ultimately never made it into the finished film. Filmmakers ultimately decided to remove this more extreme version of the sequence because test audiences and the creative team felt that watching Bruce set a colleague's hair on fire, even accidentally or through the use of godlike powers, pushed the character too far into genuinely unsettling or mean-spirited territory, undermining the warmer, more redemptive character arc the filmmakers were trying to build for Bruce throughout the rest of the story. Interestingly, in a related scene that did survive into the film in a somewhat altered form, Bruce and Evan share a moment of reconciliation later in the story, during which Bruce is shown magically fixing Evan's hair, a small remaining trace of that earlier, more extreme deleted material. The film's deleted and altered scenes extend well beyond just the Evan Baxter storyline, revealing just how much material was written, filmed, and ultimately reworked throughout the editing process in order to achieve the right overall tone for the finished movie. Several additional prayer-answering sequences were filmed showing Bruce responding to individual specific requests from people across Buffalo before the production ultimately settled on the broader, simpler storyline involving Bruce answering every single prayer in the city with a blanket yes. One particularly poignant deleted sequence reportedly showed Bruce encountering and motivating a physically disabled child struggling to climb ropes during a school gym class, only for God to later reveal to Bruce the complicated, morally ambiguous long-term consequences of that seemingly kind intervention, showing that the child would grow up to abandon a more meaningful path in life, such as potentially becoming a poet, in favor of pursuing bodybuilding, misusing performance-enhancing substances, and eventually ending up managing a small muffin shop instead. Another cut storyline involved a woman who prays for financial relief after Bruce causes her to slip and fall on spilled milk inside a grocery store, allowing her to successfully sue the store for a large financial settlement with the convenient assistance of a nearby lawyer, only for God to later reveal to Bruce that this financial windfall came at a steep personal cost, as the woman was originally destined to swallow her pride and reconcile with an estranged sister, a reunion that this new financial windfall ultimately prevented, leaving her wealthier but permanently distant from her family. These kinds of morally complex, bittersweet story threads reveal that the filmmakers experimented with a much more philosophically layered version of the prayer-answering storyline before ultimately streamlining it down into the simpler citywide lottery chaos that made it into the final theatrical cut. A choice that likely helped keep the film's pacing brisk and accessible for a broad mainstream comedy audience rather than getting bogged down in numerous individual side stories. Beyond the film's darker or more morally complicated deleted material, the production also generated its fair share of purely lighthearted and downright silly moments that never made it to theaters but have since become beloved pieces of trivia among longtime fans of the film. One especially memorable deleted moment involves an unexpected and thoroughly bizarre sight gag in which Bruce, in the midst of experimenting with his newfound powers, ends up conjuring a live monkey directly out of a random gang member's pants, a gag so purely absurd and cartoonish that it perfectly represents the kind of unrestrained, anything-goes comedic energy that Jim Carrey has long been known for throughout his career, even if this particular joke ultimately proved too strange or tonally inconsistent to make the final cut. Another small but charming deleted moment shows Jennifer Aniston's character, Grace, casually browsing through a tabloid magazine while shopping at a grocery store, glancing at a cover story featuring exaggerated celebrity gossip headlines, a subtle little background gag that added some extra flavor and realism to Grace's everyday world outside of her relationship with Bruce, even though it ultimately did not make it into the theatrical version of the film. Jim Carrey's dedication and perfectionism as a performer also became something of a notable production detail during filming, with reports indicating that Carrey frequently insisted on shooting an unusually high number of takes for many of his key scenes throughout the production, sometimes reportedly pushing for as many as 30 separate takes of a single moment in order to explore every possible comedic angle and physical choice before feeling satisfied with the results. While this kind of exhaustive, perfectionist approach to performance can sometimes slow down a production schedule considerably, It also speaks to just how seriously Carrey took the comedic craftsmanship behind his performance, treating even seemingly simple scenes as opportunities to experiment and refine his physical comedy until he found exactly the right rhythm and timing. This meticulous approach likely contributed significantly to the film's overall polish, as many of Bruce Almighty's most memorable comedic beats rely heavily on precise physical timing, exaggerated facial expressions, and carefully calibrated vocal delivery, all trademarks of Carrey's specific comedic style that requires significant experimentation and repetition to perfect. The technical filmmaking challenges involved in convincingly depicting a man with the powers of God also required significant behind-the-scenes ingenuity from the film's visual effects and production design teams. Sequences such as Bruce dramatically parting a simple bowl of tomato soup at the dinner table, or later walking effortlessly across the surface of a swimming pool as an exaggerated homage to biblical miracles, required careful coordination between practical effects work and digital visual effects enhancement in order to make these moments feel simultaneously impressive and comedically playful rather than overly serious or technically showy. Given the film's status as fundamentally a mainstream studio comedy rather than a big-budget science fiction or fantasy blockbuster, the visual effects work throughout Bruce Almighty needed to strike a careful balance, remaining convincing enough to support the fantastical premise of the story while never overshadowing the comedic performances or pulling excessive attention away from the human, emotional core of Bruce's personal journey. Director Tom Shadyack's overall approach to balancing comedy and sincerity throughout the production also played a significant role in shaping how funny moments were captured and structured throughout filming. Having already successfully directed Jim Carrey in the enormously popular comedy Liar Liar several years earlier, Shadyack understood intimately how to create a productive, comfortable environment on set that allowed Carrey the creative freedom to experiment and improvise while still maintaining enough structure to keep the production on schedule and ensure the film's broader emotional and narrative arc remained intact. According to those who worked closely on the editorial side of the production, Shadyack was notably attentive to pacing concerns throughout the editing process, at times expressing specific worry that certain standout comedic sequences, most notably the now iconic Steve Carell teleprompter scene, risked making the film feel like it was peaking too early in its runtime, potentially leaving later scenes feeling comparatively less impactful by contrast. This kind of careful, thoughtful attention to overall comedic rhythm and pacing throughout the editing process reflects just how much deliberate craftsmanship went into shaping Bruce Almighty beyond simply stringing together a series of funny individual moments, ensuring that the film's comedic highs were distributed thoughtfully across its full runtime rather than front-loaded entirely within its first act. The film's commercial success upon release only further cemented just how effectively all of these various behind-the-scenes elements, from clever writing and inspired improvisation to careful editing and thoughtful visual effects work, came together into a finished product that resonated powerfully with mainstream audiences. Bruce Almighty opened during the historically competitive Memorial Day weekend box office period in May of 2003, going up directly against several other major releases that same weekend, including the highly anticipated science fiction sequel The Matrix Reloaded, along with the family comedy Daddy Daycare starring Eddie Murphy and the superhero sequel X2, X-Men United. Despite this intense competition from several other major studio releases, Bruce Almighty managed to claim the top spot at the domestic box office during its opening weekend, a genuinely surprising outcome to many industry analysts at the time given just how much buzz and anticipation surrounded The Matrix Reloaded specifically that same summer. This unexpected box office victory speaks powerfully to just how much mainstream appeal Bruce Almighty possessed, successfully drawing in audiences across a wide range of demographics thanks to its family-friendly blend of broad physical comedy, genuine emotional sincerity, and the powerful star draw of Jim Carrey at the height of his box office popularity. Even years after its initial release, Bruce Almighty has remained a frequently discussed and fondly remembered production within Hollywood circles, largely due to just how many of its behind-the-scenes stories, deleted scenes, and improvised comedic moments continue to circulate and resurface among dedicated fans of the film. The story of how Steve Carell's now iconic performance helped launch him toward future stardom remains one of the most frequently cited pieces of trivia associated with the entire production, often held up as a clear example of how a strong supporting performance in the right role at the right moment can meaningfully alter the trajectory of an actor's entire career. Similarly, the numerous stranger, darker, or simply more absurd deleted scenes that never made it into the theatrical cut continue to offer fascinating insight into just how many creative directions the filmmakers experimented with before ultimately settling on the specific tone and structure that made the finished film such a widespread commercial and cultural success. Taken together, all of these various behind-the-scenes details help paint a fuller picture of Bruce Almighty not simply as a finished product audiences enjoyed in theaters, but as the result of a genuinely collaborative, experimental, and at times wonderfully unpredictable filmmaking process, one defined by generous improvisation, careful editorial craftsmanship, and a talented ensemble cast willing to fully commit themselves to even the most outrageous comedic scenarios in service of the film's larger, surprisingly heartfelt story about gratitude, humility, and what it truly means to appreciate the life we already have. Bruce Almighty occupies a fascinating and somewhat unusual place within the broader landscape of American cinema, functioning simultaneously as a mainstream studio comedy built around Jim Carrey's larger-than-life comedic persona and as a genuinely thoughtful exploration of religious and philosophical themes that have been debated and discussed by theologians, film critics, and casual viewers alike for more than 2 decades since its original release. To fully understand the cultural significance of Bruce Almighty, it helps to place the film within the long tradition of movies that have attempted to explore humanity's relationship with the divine through a comedic lens, a tradition that stretches back decades before Bruce Almighty ever reached theaters. The most obvious and frequently cited predecessor to Bruce Almighty is the 1977 film Oh, God!, starring George Burns as a folksy, approachable version of the Almighty who chooses an ordinary supermarket worker to spread his message to the modern world. While Bruce Almighty shares certain surface-level similarities with this earlier film, both movies exploring the comedic potential of God interacting directly with an unremarkable, everyday human being, the two films ultimately take meaningfully different approaches to their central premise. Where Oh God! Is primarily concerned with themes of belief and skepticism, questioning whether modern society is capable of recognizing genuine divine intervention when it appears in an unassuming form. Bruce Almighty instead flips this dynamic entirely by actually handing over God's own powers directly to its flawed human protagonist, creating a much more active, hands-on exploration of what it might actually feel like to wield the responsibilities of divinity firsthand. This distinction matters significantly, because it allowed the writers and filmmakers behind Bruce Almighty to explore deeper questions about power, responsibility, and the true nature of free will in ways that a more traditional divine visitation narrative could not easily accomplish. The film's connection to biblical scripture runs deeper than most casual viewers likely realize upon their first watch, with the story's underlying structure drawing heavily and quite deliberately from the Book of Job, one of the oldest and most philosophically challenging books found within the Hebrew Bible. The Book of Job famously tells the story of a righteous man who suffers a series of devastating personal tragedies despite having lived a faithful and morally upright life, ultimately leading him to question why a supposedly just and loving God would allow such suffering to befall someone who has done nothing to deserve it. Bruce Almighty modernizes and comedically reframes this ancient theological question by presenting Bruce Nolan as a man who, though far from perfect, experiences what feels to him like an overwhelming and unfair series of personal and professional setbacks within a single devastating day, ultimately leading him to angrily challenge God's competence and fairness in managing the universe, echoing Job's own frustrated questioning of divine justice found within the original biblical text. While Bruce's complaints are certainly presented with far more comedic exaggeration than Job's genuinely tragic circumstances, largely because Bruce's misfortunes stem primarily from his own self-centered attitude and entitled expectations rather than any true cosmic injustice. The underlying philosophical question posed by both stories remains strikingly similar. Namely, whether human beings are truly capable of understanding or fairly judging the complex, larger-scale considerations that guide divine decision-making. This connection to the Book of Job elevates Bruce Almighty beyond a simple comedic premise and situates the film within a much older and more serious tradition of storytelling concerned with theodicy, the philosophical and theological effort to reconcile the existence of suffering and hardship with the concept of a benevolent, all-powerful God. Religious commentators, film critics, and faith-based publications engaged extensively with Bruce Almighty upon its release, offering a wide range of perspectives on how successfully the film balanced its comedic elements with its underlying spiritual themes. Several religious film critics praised the movie specifically for its thoughtful and surprisingly respectful treatment of God as a character, with numerous reviewers highlighting Morgan Freeman's portrayal as a particularly effective and believable representation of divine wisdom and compassion. One notable religious commentary specifically praised the casting choice of Freeman as genuinely inspired, arguing that his performance successfully invited feelings of reverence and faith from audiences even during the film's more overtly comedic moments, a difficult balance to strike given the inherently silly premise of a mortal man temporarily wielding godlike powers. Other religious critics engaged more directly with the film's specific theological content, pointing out that the story explores meaningful questions about how prayer actually functions, why God does not simply grant every human request instantly and unconditionally, and how free will operates alongside divine sovereignty within a complex, interconnected world. Some Christian film reviewers offered more cautious or mixed assessments, acknowledging that certain elements of the film's humor, including some crude jokes and morally questionable behavior displayed by Bruce throughout much of the story, sat somewhat uncomfortably alongside its more sincere spiritual messaging, creating a tonal tension that not every critic felt was fully resolved by the film's conclusion. Despite these more mixed critical reactions from certain corners of religious media, there was broad general agreement among faith-based commentators that Bruce Almighty represented a mainstream Hollywood film that took spiritual and religious questions more seriously than most contemporary comedies of its era, engaging with concepts of gratitude, humility, and divine love in ways that resonated meaningfully with many religious viewers, even those who might not typically seek out explicitly faith-based entertainment. The film's exploration of the concept of grace, both as a literal character name and as a broader theological concept, represents one of its more subtle and thoughtfully constructed layers of meaning. Jennifer Aniston's character is deliberately named Grace, a choice that carries clear symbolic weight throughout the story, given that in Christian theology, grace refers specifically to the unmerited, freely given love and favor that God extends to humanity, offered not because people have earned or deserved it through their own actions, but simply out of God's own boundless compassion. Throughout the film, Bruce's relationship with the character Grace mirrors his broader spiritual journey in a deliberate and meaningful way, as his growing self-centeredness and preoccupation with personal ambition causes him to increasingly take Grace's love and patience for granted, much as his relationship with faith itself becomes distorted by his own selfish desires and entitled expectations. It is only once Bruce learns to appreciate grace not as something he is owed or can control, but as a genuine gift freely given despite his flaws, that he is able to achieve the kind of authentic personal growth the story has been building toward throughout its runtime. This layered symbolic use of the name Grace has been noted and discussed extensively by religious film critics and casual viewers alike, and it remains one of the more elegant and thoughtfully constructed elements of the film's overall screenplay, demonstrating that despite its broad comedic sensibilities, Bruce Almighty was crafted with genuine attention to deeper thematic and symbolic resonance. Beyond its specifically religious themes, Bruce Almighty also engages meaningfully with broader philosophical questions about power and responsibility that extend well beyond any single religious tradition, questions that have made the film resonate with audiences regardless of their personal religious beliefs or lack thereof. The film's central narrative arc, in which Bruce is granted immense power only to discover that this power comes bundled with immense responsibility and unintended consequences, echoes a theme that has appeared across countless stories throughout literature and popular culture, perhaps most famously articulated within the superhero genre through the well-known principle that with great power comes great responsibility. This thematic parallel has been noted by numerous film analysts and casual viewers over the years, who have observed that Bruce Almighty essentially functions as a kind of superhero origin story turned inside out, following a protagonist who is granted extraordinary abilities not in order to become a heroic figure fighting external villains, but rather in order to confront and ultimately overcome his own internal flaws of selfishness, entitlement, and ingratitude. This universal, secular framing of the film's core themes helps explain part of why Bruce Almighty was able to achieve such broad commercial success across such a wide range of audiences, appealing not only to viewers specifically interested in its religious content, but also to general comedy audiences drawn simply to Jim Carrey's comedic performance and the inherently entertaining premise of a man learning to navigate the absurd challenges of divine power. The commercial success achieved by Bruce Almighty upon its release carries genuine historical significance within the broader context of early 2000s Hollywood box office trends. When the film opened during the Memorial Day holiday weekend of May 2003, it achieved a genuinely remarkable financial result, earning approximately $86 million across its opening 4-day holiday weekend, a total that established a new record for the highest Memorial Day weekend opening in box office history at that specific point in time, surpassed at that moment only by the earlier record set by The Lost World, Jurassic Park. This achievement becomes even more impressive when considered within the specific competitive context of that particular release weekend, since Bruce Almighty was competing directly against several other major studio releases hitting theaters around the very same time, including the enormously anticipated science fiction sequel The Matrix Reloaded, which many industry analysts and box office prognosticators had widely expected to dominate that weekend's box office results given the massive cultural anticipation surrounding the Matrix franchise at that particular cultural moment. Remarkably, Bruce Almighty managed to claim the top spot at the domestic box office that weekend, successfully outperforming The Matrix Reloaded despite the science fiction sequel's considerably higher public profile and anticipation heading into release. A genuinely surprising outcome that generated considerable discussion within the entertainment industry at the time regarding the enduring commercial power of Jim Carrey as a comedic box office draw. This particular box office victory also held additional personal significance specifically for Jim Carrey's own career trajectory, as the film's opening weekend numbers ultimately represented the single highest opening weekend total of Carrey's career up to that point, surpassing his previous personal best, which had been set by his earlier holiday comedy How the Grinch Stole Christmas. This particular personal box office record held by Carrey would remain unbroken for an unusually long period of time, standing for nearly 2 decades until it was finally surpassed by the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 in 2022, a film in which Carrey himself starred as the villainous Dr. Robotnik, meaning that Carrey essentially ended up breaking his own long-standing personal box office record nearly 20 years after originally setting it with Bruce Almighty. Despite this tremendous commercial success within North American markets, Bruce Almighty also became the center of considerable religious and cultural controversy in several countries around the world, particularly within a number of predominantly Muslim-majority nations where the film's premise was viewed as religiously offensive or inappropriate. The film was formally banned from theatrical release in several countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, Qatar, and Kuwait, primarily due to religious objections surrounding the film's central premise of depicting God as an ordinary, visually unremarkable human man played by an actor on screen. A portrayal that many religious authorities within these countries considered fundamentally disrespectful or theologically inappropriate according to their own particular religious traditions and cultural sensitivities regarding depictions of the divine. This international controversy highlights just how differently the film's central creative premise was received depending on the specific cultural and religious context of different audiences around the world, illustrating the genuinely complex and sometimes contentious nature of attempting to depict explicitly religious themes and figures within mainstream, broadly commercial entertainment intended for global audiences. Interestingly, some of these initial bans were not permanent, with certain countries including Malaysia eventually reversing their original prohibition after granting the film an appropriately restricted adult content rating, suggesting that the controversy, while genuinely significant at the time of the film's initial release, was not necessarily viewed as entirely irreconcilable by every relevant regulatory body over time. The commercial success of Bruce Almighty naturally led Universal Pictures to pursue further expansion of the property, resulting in the development and eventual release of a spin-off sequel titled Evan Almighty in 2007, a film that shifted its central narrative focus away from Jim Carrey's character entirely and instead followed Steve Carell's character Evan Baxter, who by this point had been promoted from a rival local news anchor into a newly elected United States congressman. Loosely inspired by the biblical story of Noah's Ark, Evan Almighty saw Morgan Freeman returning once again to reprise his role as God, this time instructing Evan to construct a massive ark in preparation for an impending flood, a premise that allowed the film to explore its own distinct set of biblical themes separate from the original film's focus on the Book of Job. Notably, neither Jim Carrey nor Jennifer Aniston chose to return for this spin-off sequel, and the character of Bruce Nolan himself is never directly referenced or mentioned anywhere within Evan Almighty, effectively allowing the film to function as a loosely connected companion piece rather than a direct continuation of Bruce's specific personal storyline. From a pure production standpoint, Evan Almighty holds a particularly notable and somewhat unfortunate distinction within Hollywood history, as its substantial production budget of approximately $175 million, driven significantly by the enormous practical costs associated with constructing a genuinely massive, functional ark set and managing extensive live animal wrangling throughout production, made it at the time one of the most expensive comedy films ever produced in Hollywood history. Despite this enormous financial investment, Evan Almighty ultimately underperformed significantly at the global box office relative to its costs, earning approximately $174 million worldwide. A result that essentially left the film barely breaking even on its theatrical box office performance alone before accounting for the substantial additional costs typically associated with marketing and distribution, ultimately positioning the film as one of the more infamous box office disappointments of that particular era, especially when directly compared against the enormous financial success achieved by its predecessor just a few years earlier. The relative failure of Evan Almighty compared to the original film's massive success offers an interesting case study in the unpredictable nature of franchise expansion within Hollywood, illustrating how the specific comedic chemistry, star power, and thematic focus that made Bruce Almighty such an effective and beloved film did not necessarily translate seamlessly into a spin-off built around a different central character and premise, even while retaining several key creative personnel, including director Tom Shadyac and star Morgan Freeman. Industry analysts have frequently pointed to several potential explanations for this significant difference in box office outcomes between the two films, including the absence of Jim Carrey's uniquely bankable comedic star power, a noticeably different overall tone that leaned more heavily into family-friendly humor rather than the more adult-oriented comedic sensibility that characterized the original film, and the inherently more challenging and expensive production requirements associated with realistically depicting the construction of a massive biblical ark compared to the more modest, contained visual effects requirements of the original film's premise. Despite Evan Almighty's disappointing box office performance, the broader Almighty franchise concept did leave a lasting mark on popular culture, with Morgan Freeman's portrayal of God across both films becoming widely recognized as one of the most iconic and beloved cinematic depictions of the divine in modern film history. An association so strong that Freeman would later go on to host and narrate an entirely separate documentary television series titled The Story of God with Morgan Freeman, further cementing his cultural association with thoughtful, dignified explorations of religious and spiritual themes well beyond the comedic context of the original Bruce Almighty film. Beyond its specific religious themes and box office achievements, Bruce Almighty also holds a notable place within the broader career trajectory and cultural legacy of its lead star, Jim Carrey, arriving at a particularly interesting moment within his overall career evolution. By 2003, Carrey had already firmly established himself as one of Hollywood's most bankable comedic stars throughout the 1990s. But he had also begun deliberately diversifying his career by taking on more dramatically ambitious roles in acclaimed films like The Truman Show and Man on the Moon, projects that demonstrated his significant range as an actor beyond pure physical comedy. Bruce Almighty represented something of a return to Carrey's more traditional comedic roots following this period of dramatic experimentation, while still incorporating meaningful emotional depth and genuine character growth into its story, suggesting that Carrey and his collaborators had found an effective way to blend his broad comedic instincts with the kind of emotional substance that had earned him such strong critical acclaim in his more dramatic work. This particular blend of broad comedy and genuine emotional sincerity would go on to become something of a defining characteristic for much of Carrey's subsequent film work throughout the mid-2000s, appearing again in films like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which many critics consider among the finest work of his entire career, suggesting that Bruce Almighty played a meaningful role in helping Carrey further refine and develop this particular creative approach to blending comedy and genuine emotional depth within his broader body of work. The critical reception of Bruce Almighty upon its initial release was notably mixed, reflecting the genuinely complex and sometimes contradictory nature of a film attempting to balance broad mainstream comedy with sincere spiritual themes. The film holds a relatively modest approval rating among professional film critics, with many reviewers specifically praising Jim Carrey's comedic performance and the genuinely inspired supporting work delivered by Steve Carell, while simultaneously criticizing the film for what some viewed as an overly sentimental or excessively simplistic emotional resolution to its more complex philosophical and theological questions. This particular critical tension, between admiration for the film's comedic execution and skepticism toward its more sincere emotional and spiritual ambitions, reflects a broader ongoing critical conversation about the challenges inherent in successfully blending broad mainstream comedy with genuinely substantive thematic content. A combination that even the most successful examples within this specific subgenre have often struggled to fully reconcile, according to professional film critics. Despite these more mixed critical assessments, however, Bruce Almighty has demonstrated remarkable staying power within popular culture over the more than 2 decades since its original release, remaining a frequently referenced and rewatched film among general audiences, a testament to just how effectively its blend of memorable comedic set pieces, genuine emotional sincerity, and thoughtful engagement with universal questions about gratitude, humility, and personal responsibility managed to resonate with everyday viewers, even if certain professional critics remain more divided in their overall assessment of the film's artistic achievements. Taken together, all of these various cultural and historical dimensions help explain why Bruce Almighty continues to be discussed, analyzed, and fondly remembered by audiences more than 2 decades after its original theatrical release. The film's thoughtful engagement with ancient biblical themes drawn from the Book of Job, combined with its broader universal exploration of power, responsibility, and gratitude, allowed it to resonate with a remarkably wide range of audiences across different religious backgrounds and cultural contexts. Even as its specific creative choices generated genuine controversy and formal censorship in certain international markets. Its record-breaking box office success helped reshape expectations around what a mainstream comedy featuring a major comedic star could achieve financially, while its eventual spin-off sequel offered an interesting and instructive case study in the unpredictable challenges of franchise expansion within Hollywood. Perhaps most significantly, the film's careful, respectful, and genuinely thoughtful portrayal of God through Morgan Freeman's iconic performance helped establish a new template for how mainstream Hollywood cinema could approach explicitly religious and spiritual themes without alienating general audiences, demonstrating that thoughtful engagement with questions of faith, gratitude, and personal responsibility could successfully coexist alongside broad, accessible comedic entertainment, a genuinely difficult balance that few films before or since have managed to strike quite as successfully or as memorably as Bruce Almighty ultimately did.